Hi there, my name is Philip Ideson. I want to welcome you to the Art of Procurement podcast, the podcast that helps you, a forward-thinking procurement professional, position yourself and your team to proactively take advantage of the revolution that's taking place in procurement today. By interviewing industry trailblazers and sharing insights from our own experiences, my team and I pull back the curtain and shine a light on the strategies, tactics, and tools that procurement teams are using to elevate their impact. And today I want to share with you a conversation from a recent AOP Live webinar, Opportunities for Procurement to Leverage the Rising Contingent Workforce. In this conversation, I was joined by Morten Petersen, the co-founder and CEO of Worksome, as well as James Nicholls, Worksome's head of enterprise. We discuss a number of topics around contingent workforce, how contingent workforce is changing, procurement's role in helping our organizations think about talent with a broader perspective, and we talk about how we can bring a lot of value in this category, how we can drive innovation and really go beyond savings. Finally, we discuss how to avoid doing more harm than good. I also want to note that we created a downloadable checklist with key takeaways from today's episode that is available for download just by visiting the show notes page at artofprocurement.com/episode 481. That's artofprocurement.com/episode 481. Now, as regular listeners will know, my first question is often, did you find procurement or did procurement find you? Well, in this webinar, I mixed things up just a little bit and started by asking Morten, how did you end up specializing in contingent workforce?
Good question. It's a little bit by chance, as I guess it always is, right? But before doing this Worksome thing, I spent 5 years with Google as a part of the management team out of Copenhagen, Denmark. And at the time being in Google, we were 100,000 full-time employees or so, I think, and 100,000 contractors. And it was very evident that the way that we work with full-time employees was much more smooth and clean than the way we actually work with contractors. So I was struggling with the hideous systems and processes and software, and I kind of thought that we must be able to do this better by utilizing technology. And then I made the leap forward, and here we are.
So an entrepreneur at heart, then, you see a challenge and you want to try and address it and try and find solutions to make life easier.
I guess so, yes.
And James, I want to pose the same question for you. How did you find yourself within the contingent workforce space?
Yeah, a very different side of the fence, actually. So I started off in recruitment and bumbled into that, as a lot of people do, and started off in contract recruitment a very long time ago with some of the kind of bigger players, computer people, which are part of Adecco, people like that. So really kind of started off from the other side of recruiting for big companies and just seeing how complicated and difficult it was actually just recruiting from that side, and then kind of moved through more into the digital skills as they started to arise around the kind of turn of the millennium, and on from that a lot into the kind of advertising world, which is very mature around the kind of contract and freelance model. So learned a lot from that, and then very luckily some people I knew from Juno that people might be familiar with, which is one of the first kind of marketplaces and platforms out there, reached out about 8 years ago, became their first employee and head of commercial, and from that got very kind of heavily into the kind of FMS tech side of things, and really kind of the disruptions around how enterprises are connecting with talent, how they enter the enterprise, and just the entire kind of changing world of that. So disrupting the recruitment industry that I started with, which was fun.
So between you, there's a lot of experience, and you're coming from different angles, which is really interesting, just for the context of the conversation today. And so as we're going through and the questions, please feel free to kind of jump in, add any thoughts, comments that you might have as I pose these. I'm going to start with my first question. Morten, I'm going to pose this to you first of all. I'm just interested, for context, how is contingent workforce right now fitting into the overall talent management strategies that you see being used by companies today?
Well, I think that probably differs a lot across different types of companies, right? But I think there's a very true trend going on in the world of work right now, and it has been going on for many years. And even before we started talking about this, there was this slide towards individuals choosing a more flexible working style, right? There's been a trend for many, many, many years. And believe it or so, people also talked about remote work even before this COVID thing hit us, right? So it's been a long undergoing trend. And even when we started our company back in 2017, the future of work was definitely a chat that was going on, right? And I think the main motivation behind this is really that people are choosing a different style of work. Many people are, not all, but some. And I think the trend that we're seeing right now is actually more driven by the talent side of the equation than the company side of the equation. So sometimes when we talk about, yes, you should have more flexibility to sort of cut costs if you want to and stuff like that, it's a little bit the wrong discussion. I think we talk about the war for talent, right? And reality is that a big chunk of the talent pool is moving to a more flexible work style, and you as a company need to accommodate towards this, right? And depending on the group of people you're looking for, it will be a bigger part of your strategy or a smaller part of your strategy. But I think it's always a growing part of your strategy going forward if you want to keep yourself in the forefront of that.
And so do you see these trends? I mean, I think they've been accelerated by COVID, but I've been tracking these trends in contingent workforce for 10 plus years, and actually was always surprised that they didn't take hold a little bit more after the last recession, when you had organizations looking for more flexible workforces. But we kind of forgot everything and all the fixed costs associated with FTEs, and everybody went on spending sprees again, and didn't necessarily focus so much in contingent that I thought they would. Do you think that this time it's different? That these macro trends are so kind of evolved, if you will, that there's no turning back at this point?
I think it is for two reasons, right? So one is that it's now, we are critical mass, right? There's so many people stepping out of this regular way of working that you simply can't ignore it, whatever company you may be, right? But I also think that it's different because the motivation for the change now is not purely cost driven, right? I think that many companies, even the most traditional ones, sort of were actually forced to experience throughout COVID that you can actually work in a different way than you did the last 50 years, right? I even had that example with our chairman, and he's of the old school. He's the third generation owner of a sort of construction company for God knows why. But anyway, he's our chairman. He's an investor, so that's why. But he basically told me confidentially, so don't tell anyone, during one of our conversations, and that before COVID, when people were asking to work from home, he kind of thought they were cheating him out of the work hours, right? And then he was forced in isolation, had to work from home himself, and he came to realize this is actually pretty efficient. And he's now continuing to work from home 2 days a week himself, right? So I think many companies, however traditional, have sort of learned that there is a world where it's not 100% the one or the other thing, whether that is full-time employees or freelancers, contractors, or is work from the office, work from home, right? So
yeah, I think that's a great point as well, because I think in my career, I've worked from home for 10 plus years, mostly before I went on my journey, my entrepreneurial journey to set my own company up. And I would always think that people in the office would think that I'm trying to get away with not working so hard, or like you say, cheating. And I think you have to get over that hurdle.
Where are you, Philip? Tell us the truth.
The truth is that I would work different hours, so you would work. My focus was always like, if I get the job done and if I drive the outcomes, it doesn't necessarily matter which of the hours during the day I would work. But I always felt like I had to make sure the little green light was on my Microsoft Outlook, so my leadership team thought that I was sat at my computer doing something. And that became more of an issue, was like the perception that you're sat at your desk between those hours, because that's how value is measured, versus actually what outcomes are you driving, and that's how we should measure.
Absolutely.
And that's the challenge I always had.
Yeah. And you can sort of understand why that's the case, right? Because back in the days where we sort of decided that a workday was 8 hours or whatever, right? It sort of dates all the way back to the Industrial Revolution. And back then, when people were to come into the factory in 3 shift, it kind of makes sense they were actually in the factory, right? When they were supposed to be. Work from home was not really a thing. It's just so different to change our habits when it's sort of been with us for so many years, right?
Right.
So
and I guess that's what COVID was, is a forcing factor that you have to find a way to overcome that, because there wasn't a choice at that point.
Yeah, absolutely.
So
but I just want to
opened up a mindset.
Make it clear that for me, flexible work is not about working from home or in the office. It is about sort of flexibility in all of its shapes and forms, right? So contractors could most definitely work from the office, or they can work from home. The contingent workforce could do both, right? So it's not necessarily that division, as an FTE could both, right? So
I want to bring procurement into this, and I'm going to ask James a couple of questions related to procurement. In procurement, we're looking at buying a lot of things as a service and moving as many of the things that we do buy to as a service, because then we can buy based on outcomes, and we can contract based on outcomes. Are you seeing that the way that procurement is buying contingent labor, is that changing, or is that something that perhaps should change and we're behind the 8 ball? I'd love to kind of see what you're seeing in the procurement space specifically.
It's a bit of both, I would say. I would say the norm is being behind the 8 ball, to be honest. I think procurement is still looking at this from quite a historical point of view, buying it very much from a ticking boxes point of view, and as you touched on at the start, very much focused on costs. And one of my things is very much about different types of KPIs and looking at innovation and looking at experience in particular, actually. So I think there's some really, really good examples of procurement leading some wonderful projects across the market, but I would say it's kind of 10-20%. Most of the clients we work with are senior procurement, and they're in very, very big companies, and they're doing some very innovative things. So it's definitely possible. But I do think there's a lot of fear, because I think it's a very new category. It's not a new category, but I think the technology is very new. Right. And like anything, it was almost kind of like IT 20, 30 years ago. You've got IBM, you've got Microsoft, you've got the big players. It's very easy to kind of buy those people, put them into your company, and I hope that that's what you should be doing. But actually, over time, it's the smaller players, it's the collaborative players, it's the people that are kind of not fixed and are kind of very collaborative at the moment, to be able to kind of come into your company and kind of work with you to build a system around that. So yeah, I do think there's a lot of fear. I do think there's a lack of understanding, and that's not because people are stupid. It's because it's brand new, and even as us, every day we have a different competitor. Every day we come up against a different supplier. We talk to our procurement people, and it's like, oh, who's that? What do they do? Right. And then there's 10,000 marketplaces now. So I think there's also a kind of an ecosystem. There needs to be almost a set of guides in the ecosystem now. It's like people know, for instance, that they need to attach to open talent networks. The rises of direct marketplaces and be able to tap directly quickly into marketplaces. But also, how do those people then enter the enterprise? You have all the box ticks, you have the background checking, you have risk, you have the compliance, and that doesn't connect with these new marketplaces. So it's almost, you know where the talent is, but actually you can't get it because you've got to go through your own internal systems, and those that tend to be run by kind of legacy systems and incumbents that aren't quite ready for this new way of working. I mean, touching on what you said earlier, outside of the kind of pandemic type of things, people have been caught out a little bit by their own business. I know a lot of the consultancies that we talk to are used to long-term engagements, 12 months, 15 months, 16 months. They can spend 30, 35 days to get someone on site at a bank, but now they've got 30-day projects and they need someone there in 5 hours, and suddenly they've got to go through a background check that traditionally took 10 days and the project's over by then. So it's like, it's how, I don't want to go into too much detail on this particular question, but that for me is looking beyond the normal boxes, looking beyond the acronyms. Like the whole world's full of acronyms, you know, ATSs, VMSs, MSPs, and it's like, what do they actually do now? How does it fit together? And actually, the future is probably a mix of all of those things, but more in kind of one process rather than lots and lots of companies trying to form one kind of muddled process, or one gigantic outsourcer kind of landing on site and trying to kind of solve everything. So yeah, I do think procurement, they've got a real chance to be rock stars. I think there's a lot of pressure on costs right now because of the pandemic. There's a lot of pressure on probably removing that kind of fixed term employee, and a lot more about contingent workforces being able to be ramped up and ramped down during different periods. Things are a lot more project based now. So I think there's a lot more pressure on procurement actually to kind of be up to speed on what is new, be able to kind of be out in the market and be happy to be talking about all of these different contingent systems and how they sit about. And I think they are now very front and center in front of C-level strategic goals. I mean, I think contingent is starting to become not one of those things that is kind of hidden and something you look at if you want to save a bit of money. It is a strategic goal. People are talking about it in boardrooms, and that then filters down into the organization and puts a lot of pressure on finding the ideal solution to that, which is probably why we're here.
Yeah, there's a lot of complexity for procurement to kind of figure out. As you say, there's new entrants in the market, there's new ways of thinking about talent, and I see that, you know, talent is traditionally, in my experience, I used to buy contingent labor, but it was 15 years ago. So, you know, the world has obviously changed a lot since then. But I would always see contingent labor, the perspective of it was, let's get a bum on a seat, versus it being, how can we strategically access talent that, you know, that is not historically available to us. And I think we're going to talk a little bit about that, you know, over the course of the next half an hour or so. I have just one last question on procurement, and this is just more of an anecdotal thing, because I'm always interested to know this. Like, in all the organizations that you come across, how many really have procurement involvement and procurement involvement to help drive the program? You know, is that still something that's early stages of procurement being involved? I mean, I'm just really interested to see how you're seeing procurement involvement change within the contingent labor space.
I would say there's definitely, I would say it's very high, actually. The companies that we deal with, I think they are pretty kind of advertising, tech focused. They're quite kind of technology, and they're kind of scale ups themselves. So they're quite used to kind of getting involved in these kind of conversations. But I think that there has been a tendency for the business almost to kind of reach out directly in certain respects, that certain parts of the business are looking for a solution because of their connections. They kind of understand where that is, and they reach out about a specific, maybe rather than the overarching, let's solve contingent workforce, they reach out about a specific problem, and then start talking to you about a supplier. And then in that respect, procurement can come in quite late, almost when the business has already told the suppliers that they're wonderful, and then it's very difficult to negotiate once you've been told you're great, which doesn't help procurement whatsoever. But I would say, I don't know whether Morten would disagree, but I think in the majority of our definitely kind of big complex deals, procurement are right at the front of it, and actually they're really integral to adoption across the business. Like, they're very visible in the meetings, they're very visible in kind of user meetings, all the way down to not just the purchasing, but why are we doing this? Because a lot of this is behavioral change and change management as well, and that's some of the biggest, probably the biggest challenge in all of this. Is like, a lot of this is change, and I think there needs to be an understanding that it doesn't have to be gigantic 18 months, 2-year change programs. Like, there's lots of different things you can do around piloting alongside that. I think people feel like they have to rip out their MSP or rip out their VMS or something that cost $100 million in 3 years to implement, and then suddenly people are telling them they've got to change it all and all of that kind of thing. So in answer to your question, really high from our perspective. I think procurement is integral. It touches so many different parts of the business and has kind of a general overview rather than specific things, because different parts of the business want to solve their issues, and they don't necessarily kind of run in parallel with all of the other things to create a very smooth process.
Yeah, I can just add that I completely agree. It was actually a little bit of a surprise for us in the beginning. I don't think I actually knew anything about anyone in procurement before this, right? And we were under the impression that this is definitely HR who will be driving this agenda going forward. But then we quickly learned that they are totally not. This sits with procurement in most organizations, right? Because this is external suppliers in any shape or form, right? And so they have to go through procurement. And I think it was a surprise to us, but I also think that procurement is actually well positioned to drive this forward. They have, generally speaking, more power in an organization than HR. Sometimes you can argue whether that's right or wrong. I'm sure procurement think it's right, but HR may beg to differ. But they actually, procurement has the power to actually push through bigger projects like this, right? That can sort of structurally change the way that the business is going about a category. So I think it sits well there. Yeah.
And Kelly, I'm going to come to you to just see if we've got any questions in so far before I dig into a little bit more around the value proposition of contingent workforce and how that's changing. So Kelly, do we have any questions yet?
We've actually had quite a few questions come in, and I'm going to try to pick a couple that I think are high level because we've been doing an overview. So Morten, this first question, a few people have asked this in slightly different ways, so I'll paraphrase. Is there a rule of thumb that you offer to companies for how they should figure out when a talent need should be met through contingent workforce and when a talent need should be met by, say, a boutique consultancy or some other kind of smallish third-party service provider?
It's difficult to say if there's a rule of thumb, right? So what I think, so this is, just to be clear, this is contingent workforce between sort of boutique agency or consultancy, right? Is that the question?
Correct. When it should be a contingent workforce deal and when there might be a different service type oriented way to meet the need.
Well, absolutely. So the way that sometimes you need someone on your team to help you to do this project, right? And sometimes you need to buy this thing from someone that you hold responsible. So I think that's sort of the distinction, right? Do you actually need a person, or do you need a thing that you can hold someone responsible to? So if you're doing stuff in-house, you should hire individuals, right? If not, you should. I don't know if that answered the question, James. Do you have anything to add here? But
I agree. I think if you've got the project management, business analysis type skills where you can kind of manage the resources coming in, and yeah, absolutely contingent workforce. But as Morten said, if it's something complex where there's lots of moving parts, it's a big liability deal, and you don't have those in-house skills, then yeah, I would answer so definitely.
Yeah, and there seems to be some cyclic behavior on this, right? So some companies will tend to insource small projects in some periods and then outsource more projects in other periods, right? Depending on the appetite for either or.
No, that's interesting. And I'm sure, I mean, certainly the success of given projects, right, is going to feed future decisions around how needs are met. James, the other question I want to ask at this point is a procurement process specific question. And Tiffany is asking this from the point of view of public sector, but I truly think this question applies across all different kinds of buying organizations, that many times procurement teams hear frustration around the length of time our process requires. And so what she's asking about is, you had mentioned it can be very hard for procurement to negotiate if clearly the company has indicated that they're excited about the opportunity to work with a specific resource. She's actually talking a little bit further down the road and saying, okay, we have a resource that everybody loves, but there are separate discrete projects. How do we make sure that the speed of the procurement process or whatever associated approvals have to be received don't lead to the company losing access to that resource sort of in between one engagement and the next?
Are you talking about kind of losing individuals in between, or?
Yes, if there's a lag in between, or if a separate department or a separate budget or something has to provide approval and there's a little bit of a lag, so it's not a completely continuous work effort. Is there anything from a process standpoint that procurement can do to tighten up the way that works internally?
Yeah, I think that's what technology systems are kind of all about right now. And Morten will talk to this because the entire kind of purpose of Worksome is removing friction, and that's basically what this is. Suppliers-wise, there shouldn't be a problem, but I think a lot of the barriers to people kind of entering the enterprise right now is half of the problems. I think one of the biggest things to look at from a procurement department is experience for the candidate, the supplier, your own users, actually, for coming into the enterprise. I mean, it's no longer necessarily about costs. I know some of the other questions have been about kind of day rates and how do we keep those down and things like that. And actually, it all comes back to experience. I think if you can definitely use systems. So a lot of what the major enterprises ask us to do is take time to hire from 30 days to 5 hours. Take background checking from 2 weeks to 1 day, take integrated kind of right to work checks, using contracts in 30 seconds. Like, I think there is a real focus on talent and sourcing that talent, but actually sourcing the talent isn't necessarily always the biggest problem. One of the biggest problems is getting that talent into the enterprise. So I think definitely keeping in communication with everybody is really important. Like when there's big silences and disappearing, I think a lot of things are manual at the moment, and now is the time to move a lot of these things technology way as well. There are lots of different platforms, not just Worksome, but lots of different platforms where all of these approvals can be built in. All of these kind of friction points that delay everything can be put into a system. One of my colleagues, Sam, is kind of evangelical about consumer technology, and this is where it's going. Like, one of the biggest problems you face attracting talent is most talent spend their life doing everything on their phone. If they want to watch a movie, they just click Netflix and in they go. If they want to get a taxi, they click it, Uber, and there it turns up. But if they want to enter an enterprise, they get stuck on an SAP system for 6 weeks. They talk to an MSP that knows nothing about their project. They have to fill in 12 disparate forms. And during none of that time, which is extensive, do they ever talk to the hiring manager that actually has all the enthusiasm for the project? They don't really talk to your brand. They're not really engaging with your brand. They're engaging with a set of barriers almost, and those barriers aren't even your company, whereas it is an MSP, it is a classification tool, it's a payment tool, it's a contract signing. So I am really, like, my entire life is sad actually, spent thought about how to improve the experience of people entering the enterprises. I genuinely think that is your brand out in the market, and people talk a lot about, oh, everyone's so expensive and we can't find talent. That's because you're not engaging the talent as a brand in the marketplace. You are treating candidates like commodities, and in return they're treating your company like a commodity. So for instance, talent clouds are the biggest things right now. Like, talent clouds ultimately is something that just retains information about the people that are talking to your business, are interested in your business, have come into your business. Even if you haven't hired them, they've come through a supplier, you found them directly. That kind of information is lost at the moment. What most companies tend to do is go out to the market repetitively. Oh, I need 10 Java developers. Out they go to the supplier network. The supplier network sends back 300 Java developers, 10 of them get hired, the 290 get forgotten about. They just disappear again. And then a week later, the same company goes back to the market for 10 Java developers. The same people apply, they go through the same systems, they get no feedback, no communication, and then 10 get hired, and then 290 disappear. And then you go back to the market again. And people are, I'm not applying to this anymore. And even if you are, I've got 10 faceless companies sending me text-heavy faceless things from a VMS that I don't really understand. And if one's 700 and one's 600, I'm going with the 700 one, because there's no personality there. I mean, the companies that we find are really, really winning are the ones that are really pushing the kind of interaction side of things. Their hiring managers are in a system. They are directly talking to the candidates they want to hire. The candidates are directly in a system talking to the hiring manager and project managers that want to hire them. Everything else is vaguely done invisibly. Like, you push a button and the right to work is done. It's not complicated. They don't even see it. You push a button, the contract is signed. They don't really see it. So what you're doing is keeping them front and center, and the conversations are consistently about the type of work that they're going to do, your culture. They're getting a really good appreciation of what the project team is like. They're getting a really good appreciation about, wow, this company are really serious. Like, I'm moving into them really quickly. I know everything about them. All of this really difficult kind of compliance stuff is being done. And then suddenly, and I'm not saying this is absolute rule of thumb, but cost becomes less of an issue. Then they're thinking less about how much money will I make from this faceless company that I don't care, and more about, wow, I really like this guy or girl. I really like this project team. Wow, I really like this project. And then suddenly you're negotiating directly as well. So I'm not going to badmouth suppliers, but if you give suppliers a budget, they're going to use all of it. Well, that's just the world. So that's a really long-winded answer to what you probably asked. But yeah, I think experience will run through a lot of these answers. I think that most companies have built and bought systems for their own view. They bought a system that they think mirrors their internal workings. But everyone will know that works in an enterprise. Most enterprises are pretty disjointed. They're pretty siloed. Most silos don't even communicate well internally. So if you build a system that mirrors that, it's going to be very disjointed, very siloed, and it's going to solve individual problems, but not necessarily as one process. So I can't even remember what the question was, but hopefully that's answered vaguely something about it. Morten, do you want to jump
in? You know, there's I think one thing that's clear is that the best talent have lots of options of where they spend their time, and the experience is really important. So if you're somebody who is very talented and is in demand, then you're going to look at an opportunity and say, I'm not going to waste my time filling in all these forms when I don't even know if anything's going to come of it, and whether I'm going to get a response, and whether I'm going to be one of 300 people doing exactly the same, because it's just not worth my time to do that. So it goes back to something you said, Morten, earlier about the kind of change on the supply and demand, and who has the leverage, so to speak, in the market now, is that it is more the talent than it is the organization, and that's a big switch. That comes into then experience, and we've been talking a lot in the procurement space about the procurement experience, and something you said, James, is really important about the fact, historically, when you think about technology, and we've done this in procurement as well, is you've looked at technology in a way that, does it do the things I want it to do? Does it take me through the 7 steps of the buying process so all my buyers can see exactly where it is at one time, without any consideration of the people on the other side of that transaction? And so that's becoming more of certainly a focus for procurement too, is the experience, because that's ultimately going to drive people to engage with you and get adoption. And that's critical in any kind of program, where you ultimately are a service provider, and procurement is a service provider to the rest of the business, as much as somebody running a contingent workforce program is. I do have some questions that we got in as we were building through the registration process, and I want to ask one, and I'll ask this to you first of all, Morten, and it's from Joyce. Joyce asks, leadership often targets contingent labor as a quick hit reduction in staffing costs, and we talked a little bit about costs earlier. I'd like to better understand cost-effective ways to manage a contingent labor program, especially during economic environments that we're in at the moment. Like, is cost even important right now, or do we have to disassociate that notion of cost from folks who are expecting us to drive cost savings in labor? Or are the tricks and tips that we can still use, even though cost of living is increasing so much through inflation?
Well, so as we talked about this also in the beginning, right? So I think it's a little bit wrong to think that if you hire a workforce, you'll save a ton of money necessarily, right? I don't think that's the way forward. I think the real opportunity to save money is actually in the stuff that James just talked about, right? In making a more efficient and better workflow that, on the one side, will give you a much better experience, both as candidate and employee of the company, but it would also give you access to much better talent, right? As a consequence of that. But you're also reducing your workflow quite dramatically, right? I mean, internally, and I think there's some massive time savings in there, right? Inside of an organization, you can optimize those workflows. I think it's there. Yes, of course, it's easier to scale down contingent workers than it is with full-time employees, so that makes sense. I don't think that's the right argument for going down that route. I think it should be the talent argument. And I think that's the important part. So I don't think it's a big savior for cost necessarily. I don't want to talk about it on that premise, at least, if you get my point on that. Yeah. But of course, it's easier to scale down the workforce. They wouldn't expect you to keep them on forever. But to be honest, neither does full-time employees, right? So what is happening in the industry right now is there's sort of a convergence between what we name as the contingent workforce and the more sort of permanent employees, right? So what you see is that tenures in normal jobs are going down quite a lot. I think it's sort of it halves from any new generations, right? We'll cut the average tenure in half, and on the same side, we also see that contractors are going up in tenure, so you have longer contracts, right? And I start to sort of see there's a convergence between the two, and it's sort of a little bit of a superficial distinction between the two categories, because if you have a full-time employee at your company for 1.5 years or even 2 years, how is that really different to a contractor that is there for 2 years, right? I'm unsure about that.
So, one of the things when I think about cost savings within this space that I think about it is, you could have a contractor who, traditionally you would bring and you would have them sat in a seat for 3 months or 6 months. It's a defined period of time. So you're paying them to be there for 3 or 6 months to do a specific task. Well, now, because of things like the access to the talent clouds that we talked about, and this kind of breaking up jobs into tasks and then not outsourcing, but bringing in experts to do specific tasks, means that instead of having to need this person for 3 months to be sat there, you only need them for 2 weeks, because that's where you're going to get the insight. So you might actually be paying them more on an hourly basis for those 2 weeks than you would somebody who's there for 3 months, but the total cost is much lower. And that's kind of how to think about the cost.
Yeah, for sure. You should probably not hire a 1,000 contractors, just keep them idle, right? So whatever comes up, they can just work on that, right? Which you sometimes maybe do with FTEs. I think that's definitely one of the benefits for you as a company, but also for that individual, right? Because it's what actually drives this forward is also the workers or the individual's desire to work on stuff that is truly exciting for them, right? And it's not very exciting sitting around waiting for the next project, to be honest. Then you'd rather get on with it, move into another company and work on that thing that you really like working on, right? So I definitely agree on that part. Absolutely.
And I just want to encourage anybody, if you do have any questions, please do keep them coming, and I'll bring Kelly in to the conversation in a little while as well. The other follow-up question, Morten, that I had is, you're talking about value and talking about things like increased cycle times. How can, or any advice you might have for a procurement professional who's listening in how to articulate the ROI of that? Where they're measured on cost savings, and where, we're talking, well, maybe, there are cost benefits of thinking about different models, but it's not necessarily, I paid somebody $20 an hour yesterday and I pay them $18 an hour today. How can they articulate the ROI benefits of, kind of thinking different about how they engage with the contingent workforce?
Should I go first, or do you want to go first, James?
Totally up to you, sir.
Well, but I think there's various things that you can into. So obviously there's the workflow, right? So you can actually start by sort of looking through your whole process today. How much time are we actually spending on this process, onboarding whatever candidate that is, right? If you really get into the depth of that, it's in many companies, I'm sure not for the ones attending this webinar because they have it under control, but in other companies, it's quite time consuming to onboard a new candidate, everything included, right? All the way from identifying the right person until you have them safely contracted and working in your company, right? So there's a lot of stuff going into that. There's also the whole sort of value chain for whenever you bring on the contingent workforce, whereas there's a lot of parties that wants a cut of that, right? Whether that is sort of third-party service that needs to go on the side of that, or just the one supplier buying from the other supplier and so forth, right? And there's a pretty long value chain with some opportunities for you to go directly to the candidates and skip some of those middle layers, which is not really value adding in the long run, at least. So I think that is some of the two big categories for savings. And then obviously the ability to attract better talent, either at the same price or better talent at a lower price, right? So those could be some of the buckets.
Yeah, I think data is the most important thing. And I know people go on and on about data, but it amazes me with the lack of data in the contingent side of things. Most companies have no idea who is in their building, who they've come through, how long they've been there, whether they've ever been there before, how much they cost before, whether one division is paying them more than the other division. I think one of the good processes to look at first, and it doesn't even need to be like a complete change management process, is just centralizing your contingent workforce somewhere and start to understand it. Like a lot of companies, and mainly the bigger ones, come to us with, these are our problems. And it's like, how do you know those are your problems? You ask them something about data and they're like, no idea. How many people have you got? No idea. How many suppliers have you got? No idea. And it's like, okay, so you don't even know what your problems are yet. And actually the first start to that is centralization. Get all of your channels in one system. Yeah? It doesn't need to be Worksome, it could be anything, but understand where is the money going? Where are your hiring managers? Who are your hiring managers? What are your rates? What are your suppliers? I don't want to be tough on suppliers, but suppliers are a very obvious cost base to target. Yeah. They used to be targeted very simply by PSL reviews. Now, take 2% off and we'll give you more business because you're better. But all that does is compromise quality, pushes people down, suppliers get upset, they move to another place that gives them more money. But on the surface, it looks like a cost saving. Right now, it's about direct networks. I mean, most companies, because they don't understand the contingent workforce and they haven't actually been out in those markets, they just depend on suppliers totally. And they depend actually, strangely, on historic suppliers. So the suppliers that would have kind of found them their permanent side of things have probably been sitting on the kind of MSP, PSLs, and all those kind of things. They go to them, and actually they are the most expensive. Half the time, they're not the most relevant. And then, so I would look at centralization, I would look at understanding your data, and then thirdly, starting to drive direct networks, because open talent networks is where it's going. Being able to, almost already, there's as many marketplaces as there are traditional recruitment suppliers. So whereas you had that age-old problem of having way too many suppliers and you need a system to manage them, already people are like, which marketplace do I go to? It's technology driven. How do I connect this marketplace to my VMS? How do I connect this marketplace? Does my MSP want to use this marketplace? So I would go and find some guides in the system, in the ecosystem. Barry Matthews and people like that over at Open Assembly are a really useful set of people. John Windsor and about 300 other Johns, it's really strange, over at the Centre for the Transformation of Work. These are really useful people that have been in the market for a long time, and what they do is basically work with enterprises. And it's not just on a consultancy basis, they work to help enterprises understand what can be done. What are these companies? Are they companies that help you get talent to enter the enterprise? Are they straight marketplaces that source talent? Do they have worker classification tools? Really kind of make sense of the market, because I still think it goes back to a lot of fear and a lot of unknown. It's like, how can I work with that company? Should I work with that company? Which marketplace should I be talking to? But that would be my view. If you can centralize, you can understand your data, you'll save a fortune straight away. If you can start moving away from traditional suppliers and more to direct networks, and there's some really, really good examples of that going on right now and have been going on right now, which we can share with various people. But yeah, people like that, I would look for people in the market like Barry and John, people like that, who really, they can just guide actually of the right people to go to. So that would be my view from a cost perspective in the first place. Just understand what you're doing today, and then you can kind of affect tomorrow.
How important is benchmarking market data still when you're looking at, because I think, traditionally, you would try and categorize role types into something that, because we put our procurement hat on, we always want to compare apples to apples, because you're doing the best you can to kind of say, okay, that job type, we can really categorize them as this. That means I have an understanding of where the baseline is, what I should be paying. Now, that was a while ago when I was involved in doing contingent labor and kind of thinking along those terms. Has that evolved, or what kind of advice do you give, or what kind of value is there still on getting that benchmark data for role types and to help you make sure that you're at least not overpaying?
It's about to evolve, would be my answer to that. I don't think it has much. I think it's really important, actually, and we're in a huge conversation with one of the world's biggest consultancies at the moment, and that's their biggest thing. So we've got 1,500 suppliers, we've got 12,000 contractors at any one time, $1 billion spend, and a system that doesn't tell us anything. And it's got all the data in there, but it doesn't show us anything. And they said our number one goal is, there's two types of data. I'm going to get on it now. There's two types of data in my view. There's the normal, external, robust CFO type, accounts payable, accounts receivable, day rates, all of those obvious things that CFOs and enterprises want to see and need to connect to systems and APIs and that sort of things. But actually the most important data right now is contextual data in a system around the hiring process. So this company in question was, we have an MSP, but now what we want is our hiring managers to enter a system and actually hire directly through the system. But what would be really useful is a set of contextual data while they're doing that. So as they post a brief, the system is reading what that brief is. The system has already realized it's this user and they've hired these skills before. It should show them whether there are any freelancers or contractors currently in their business that can fulfill this, that have already been background checked, have already been through the compliance things, that can just move project and their end dates. It will show them a range of skills and a range of rates as well, to say traditionally blah blah has paid this amount for Java developers. Just so, because it is what we're asking a lot of companies to do, is move away from that MSP outsourced, where you're basically someone else's responsibility to find me people, which is causing a lot of problems, but there's also something quite nice and cozy about throwing it over the fence and saying it's your issue. But now we're asking big companies to put all of their hiring managers into a system and directly kind of manage that. So there has to be a lot of data now in systems, and the systems that are going to win are the systems that are alive, for the want of another word. Most systems are bought off the shelf, and the only information that goes into them is your information, and the only benefit you get from it if you keep it up to date. Lots of people are working on the systems, but the new systems that are attached to marketplaces, that are attached to competitors, give you market views, have all of the candidates coming in, understand availability, all of those kind of things. They're kind of alive. I mean, they move themselves through kind of natural placement. So that's what I would look at from that side of things. I mean, data is really important, but not necessarily just the traditional data you're looking for. I would look for things that help your hiring managers make better decisions. What channel is it coming from? Is this person direct? Is it coming from a supplier? Is it coming from a PSL supplier? What rates are you looking at? Give you that kind of thing. And that's not fully fledged yet anywhere in the world, but it is coming from numerous parts of things.
Well, I'm going to, keeping a look at the clock, I want to come back to Kelly. Just see if, Kelly, you've got a question or two, and then I have at least one more that's posed to you, Morten, before we wrap up. So, Kelly, anything else, any other questions that have come in from our audience today?
There's actually two that I'm going to try to squeeze in here, given the time. Morten, earlier in our conversation, you had made a statement around procurement actually having more, power, authority, influence with regard to contingent workforce than even HR, which I can assure you is earning you all kinds of love in the chat here. But I'm also not sure most people in procurement would have expected to hear that. So we may not perceive accurately what our true potential role is in this category. So my question to you is, how would you suggest the procurement start having initial conversations around contingent workforce internally as we're planning to get more involved? And what does that relationship look like, that cross-functional management relationship look like on an ongoing basis after we start to get the program under control?
That is a really good question, right? But I think actually it starts with the control, right? So it's back to James's point of centralization. I just wanted to clarify that a little bit. So I think the one thing you should not do is to do a centralized buying hub for contingent workforce. This is what I'm seeing in some cases, right? So you don't have complete control. So you try to centralize the demand somewhere, and then you basically add more friction to the whole process. And the idea was to take that away, right? So what you centralize, which is also James's point, is sort of the data and the system. And then you should decentralize the experience in many ways and give a more direct connection between individuals and in the company and the talent you want to hire, right? But it was also a surprise to me that procurement sits with the power here. But the thing is that essentially, the contingent workforce will eventually be, in many cases, a supplier that you're paying some money, whether that is a true supplier or a individual that set up his or her own company, right? So eventually it pops up on the procurement radar, and you need to be approved as a supplier, and that is sort of the initial gatekeeping you will get to, right? So how we've ended up in many discussions with clients is actually that some hiring managers used our system, and all of a sudden it comes to scale, and as we're funneling through salaries to individuals, it gets to scale quite easily, right? And then procurement will knock at our door and say, so what's going on? We are paying a ton of bills from you guys, and it's getting to scale. Can we have this conversation, right? So, but what I think the first step should be is to actually understand what is going on in the organization today, right? And the first order of business should always be to get that under control. So who is hiring, how many, at what rate, where? Getting that full view, right? Because I think this is probably, and you can maybe get that answer in the chat, but what we hear often is that sometimes you have someone from the CFO office or wherever coming down asking procurement, how much money are we spending on contractors? And then you need to scramble for that answer by asking different divisions about what is the actual cost, and you will get some sort of answer, and you'll need to come up with that again next time someone asks, right? And you see, you need to get to the forefront of that, because then it will also be super easy to then figure out how to then optimize that process and build a project around that. See, okay, we can see that we are generally overpaying our contingent workforce for whatever reason, if that was the case. Or we can see that the workflow that is connected to the onboarding is flawed and it's time consuming. It takes 30 days. So we use 30 days as an example of bad, but I've actually seen even people in procurement and HR bragging on LinkedIn that they had a time to hire or time to from a already identified talent to be able to start working was 30 days, and they bragged about that. So it should be 30 seconds in the best world, right? So when you sort of get that layer of control, you can then get to identify what is then the most important project for you to dive into first, right? It could also be so that the contracts are a mess, right? It's completely uncompliant, inconsistent. We don't do a worker classification, which is, by the way, something you should look into if you're not already, because one of the consequences of recent developments and how contingent workforce has been on the rise is also that we are seeing a sort of scrutiny from governments being cranked up a little bit on this, because our whole Western world has been built on taxation at source, and all of a sudden you don't have that under complete control, right? So there's a lot of rumblings going on across the markets in this category. So I mean, get control first, figure out what is the most important thing for you to fix first, and then go for the next thing, right? Because there'll be plenty of things that you should fix, I'm sure, or maybe just do slightly better.
Slightly better than 30 days, right? And actually, so James, building on Morten's point about government scrutiny, I have a question here in the chat about risk. What are the risks that procurement should be aware of in terms of how we're approaching talent networks, and what should we be thinking about from the very earliest days in terms of how to manage those risks?
They're pretty obvious, actually. Most countries have some kind of law that looks like IR35 in the UK. It'll be the distinction between a 1099 and a W2 in the US, and it spans most of Europe and APAC as well. So first and foremost, what are local compliance laws for entering the enterprise? In the UK, for instance, you've got to think about right to work, seeing people's passports, money laundering in certainly regulated environments. Background checking as well is really important right now, but also time consuming. So you've got that balance. You're looking for a platform that has kind of integrated background checks and can run that, but they're very, very important. And then one of the biggest issues is supply chain and supply chain transparency at the moment. So it's all about who is actually paying the freelancer or contract their money. I mean, what has been created through a lot of the kind of the incumbent processes is someone sits over the top of it and they push all risk to the next person in the chain. That person next in the chain pushes the risk further down, and that risk keeps going down until it kind of lands on the person that physically pays it. And that could be a recruitment agency, that could be an umbrella company, that could be a platform, that could be a marketplace. And actually, IR35 in particular, same in the States, that person becomes the fee payer, and that has certain things that you have to be aware of, and whether they are accurately accruing tax, whether they are reporting, whether they are paying the right money, all the way down to an experience point of view. Does the candidate know what's being charged? All of those kind of things. So the problem with that is any problem within the supply chain that isn't accurately looked at, that rolls back up to the parent company, and that goes back up all through the chain. And the liability, regardless of what any contract says or any MSP has signed with a VMS and ongoing, that lands back with you as the client. So what you're looking for is transparency, really. Things, the shortest supply chain that you can. You don't want, as we said, an MSP contract with a recruitment agency, with an umbrella company, with a limited company, with an individual at the end of it. So getting an understanding of your supply chain and the transparency within that. And again, sorry if I confused you earlier, but centralizing that in a system, again, helps you with that. Local laws, the US is notoriously complicated. There are a lot of different things happening across a lot of different states right now coming in, and that will actually be quite dependent on the government in the States as well, and who gets in and who doesn't. California, for instance, really interesting with regards to contracting. So yeah, look, you're looking for systems that have a really deep understanding of compliance. It's not that complicated with regards to the things you need to do. They're quite well documented of compliance risks, but as Morten touched on earlier, all of these compliance lists risk bring friction, or have traditionally brought friction, and time consuming, and different types of companies and different people that kind of swing in to solve that particular problem. But there are lots of systems right now that will do that kind of in one go. But yeah, compliance is a major thing at the moment, and is being, particularly tax status, I would say that's something you need to look at from a classification point of view. Should you be withholding tax as a client, or are they actually allowed as 1099s and outside our 35 people are to actually manage their own tax affairs? That's the biggest hot button, I would say, at the moment from a government perspective.
Yeah.
I know we only have a minute or two left, so I want to tee up one final question for you, Morten. That's based on a question actually we got from Connie. Connie was asking if there was a tool or system you can find best in class for tracking your contingent workforce, and I think I got a good idea what the answer of that might be.
Well, I at least have one suggestion, right?
I've got to reframe that a little bit and ask, we've talked a lot about the challenges and the opportunities within contingent workforce. What is it that you built into Workforce, or as you were thinking of building Workforce, where you felt there's a gap that needs to be addressed? So kind of what are the gaps that you were looking to address as you built out and continue to build out Worksome?
Yeah. So yeah, I think we are trying to take away all the friction that lies in this. Boy, there's a lot of friction, right? So take away that friction by having software doing the heavy lifting. I think this is where the world is going, right? It shouldn't be more complicated, basically, to onboard a contractor into a company with everything done as work classification, background checks, whatever, contracts, NDAs, all the bells and whistles shouldn't be more complicated than hailing an Uber, really, right? So what we are trying to do is to sort of collapse that whole value chain and ecosystem into one simple software interface, right? Because we think, and also from my background at Google, that software is the answer to many of our problems, right? And we've seen this across different categories, how we've sort of, and industries, how we managed to make software sort of do all the heavy lifting. We just haven't sorted that yet in this space, and I think we should do that together. That would be nice. Yeah.
Well, I'm going to wrap up there. First of all, I want to thank our audience for joining us today in this conversation. There was, of course, as there always is, lots of different directions and other topics that I could have got into that I had to bite my lip on, because I think there's a lot to be said in contingent workforce, and it's an area that is becoming more and more important, especially as we said kind of throughout, how the conversation is changing, and organizations are not looking at this as how do I get some bums on seats to fulfill some short-term needs, but how do I access talent I didn't have access to before, because there's now new models of being able to do so. For me, that's where the true opportunity is in contingent workforce. It's completely rethinking how we go to market to get the talent we need, of which contingent is one of the ways that we can access that talent. I also want to thank Kelly for just being the eyes and the ears of our audience, and of course Morten and James. Thank you so much for all of your insights, the benefit of your experience, and just for the really interesting questions that or answers that you gave us today. So thanks for joining us. If this episode struck a chord with you, please do send it to somebody. We grow here at Art of Procurement through word of mouth, and that would be really appreciated. You can also support us by giving us a thumbs up, a star rating, or a review wherever you listen to your podcasts. Since 2015, we've built the world's largest free resource for procurement professionals looking to elevate their impact. Our resources span podcasts like this, videos, blog posts, papers, and events. To join us on the inside and to ensure you never miss an episode, a webinar, an event, or a post, please do subscribe to our weekly newsletter, This Week in Procurement. You can do that at artofprocurement.com/subscribe. That's artofprocurement.com/subscribe. Thank you for joining us today, and I look forward to seeing you again soon.